us now from CNBC Global Headquarters, Michelle Caruso-Cabrera. Michelle, the Wall Street Journal's John Hilsenrath is still with us as well. What are the headlines?
So we're talking about still the government shutdown and the exchanges opening today as a result of healthcare reform. The markets are not nearly as nervous as originally thought. We did see a sell-off yesterday, but a little more sanguine approach this morning. I think if it doesn't last very long, which is the assessment of a lot of folks, then the government shutdown doesn't necessarily have a big impact. There's a lot of skepticism that it has any kind of huge impact at all. Down 128 points yesterday, 10 points for the S&P as well. I've been listening with interest to what you guys have been talking about for the last 15 or 20 minutes. I do want you to know that there's a strong school of thought out there that says if we hit the debt ceiling, that it's not Armageddon, that we don't see skyrocketing interest rates. They keep saying default on our debt. We just heard Jay Carney say that. The chances of that happening are next to zero because you can prioritize your payments. Defaulting on debt means the U.S. government would not make an interest payment on a U.S. Treasury. Highly unlikely. And the other thing is, if you pay that late, if it were even to happen, that is not default. And for investors to suddenly sell U.S. Treasuries because there's going to be a 3-day payment late, highly unlikely, because there are not many other choices in the world.
John, is that true? Because the conventional wisdom is you miss payment, you default, our credit rating gets downgraded, our interest rates go sky high.
No, I'm not saying you're wrong. It's not a default. If you lost your house after not paying your mortgage for 3 days, but you suddenly paid it, they say, oh, wait, that's a default. I mean, is that what you're talking about?
No,
you would be upset if you lost your house right after paying late for 3 days.
I just want John's take on that.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, I agree with Michelle that this word default gets used very loosely in Washington. If the government, is late, for instance, on Social Security payments, that's not a default, and people use that term all the time. I think if they miss an interest payment on bonds, that becomes an event that is a big problem in financial markets. But it's also important to say that doesn't happen on October 17th. There's some bill payments coming due on October 24th. We could probably get past them. Then that gets you into October 31st, November 1st. That's when things start getting tight. So we have a whole month before any of that happens.
John, if you run a pension fund and you have to hold a certain amount of very liquid assets, are you going to sell your Treasury portfolio, which is probably large, because the payment is a couple days late? What else would you buy instead?
Well, so Michelle, it's always the buyer and seller on the margin, right? So the pension fund probably won't, but the hedge fund, who's trying to position himself for this, sure might. And that could put upward pressure on interest rates. But again, I agree with you that I don't think we get that far, because I think that there'll be so much pressure on people in Washington to act by then that something will happen. The other point that I want to make about all this is that viscerally, we look at these events and it looks really bad on the surface, and it feels like these are terrible events that are happening. But if you go back over the last 20, 30 years to continuing resolution crises, government shutdowns, this is actually when action happens in Washington. These are the government shut down in 95, 96. Then they passed legislation and we turned budget surpluses. The last few years, we've actually had improvements on spending.
All right, guys. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much.
Bringing it.
John.
Next time, tell us how you really feel.
I love it.
Thank you.
I love it.
Fear-mongering. Jay Carney's been fear-mongering on your network.
Okay. Thank you so much. Listening to all this talk, Nika, it's very complex when I hear them talk about